Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Kentucky Monthly Climate Perspective on Drought and Hydrologic Conditions for October 2019. I am Megan Schargorodski with the Kentucky Mesonet and the Kentucky Climate Center. With us today, we also will have Chip Zimmer and Bill Caldwell from the Kentucky Division of Water, Matt Dixon from the UK Ag Weather Center, and Stuart Foster, the director of the Kentucky Climate Center, Kentucky Mesonet, and the state climatologist. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Stu Foster.
Thank you, Megan, and welcome everyone. It has been an incredible month from a climatological perspective, so we'll get right into it this month. We have quite a bit to report when we get to the section on impacts, particularly for agriculture, but also looking at water supply concerns at this point. So Megan, let's go ahead and get started and move on to the next slide. Okay, this webinar series is presented by the Kentucky Climate Center here at Western Kentucky University in conjunction with the National Integrated Drought Information System and in coordination with the Midwest Drought Early Warning System. We've got several partners, as you know, from hearing the folks that are on the call here today. We'll be doing this webinar again the first Thursday of November. I believe that's after the time change goes back to standard time. And in addition, this webinar is being recorded and will be sent out so you'll be able to listen to it again if need be. So the outline for this month, again, we have a kind of standard setup in terms of looking at recent conditions and then impacts, take a look at outlooks for the month of October, summarize some main points, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. And I'm guessing maybe that that we may need to spend a little bit of time with that here today. So on the left side, we've got a couple slides, pictures from Herrington County showing the harvest. The weather's been good for harvesting, but in many other ways, it's been not so good. And there we've got a Pasture in Shelby County, and certainly a lot of concern there in the agricultural sector, especially livestock. We're looking at the 30-day radar estimated precipitation with the observed amounts laid over top of that. So the radar estimates come from National Weather Service radar, and again, this is an unprecedented map in the sense that we have never seen a period this time of year with such little rainfall across the state. Again, it's very, very much widespread. Many areas less than 1/10 of an inch for the entire 30-day period. Okay. If we expand out to 60 days, again, we see very consistent pattern across the state. We got a little bit of yellow there, which indicates 8 to 10 inches of rain over basically a 2-month period, which could put a few isolated locations a little bit above a normal for that period. But otherwise, lots of greens and even some blues that are in the 1 to 2 inch total. So again, this is for basically 2 months worth of precipitation. Again, incredibly low values dominated by the last 30 days. And then going out farther to 90 days, here we see the green being concentrated in kind of north central, I'll call that north central part of Kentucky. A lot of us are trying to figure out if there's a kind of regional designation for that area. And then over in eastern Kentucky, a good bit of green. And if you've been on the calls before, you may recall that, again, if we go back a couple months, those were the parts of the state that were first starting to show signs of dryness, when other areas of the state were wetter. And again, that shows up here that we have totals in the southern tier of counties and up in the northeastern part of the state that are in the 7 to 10 or 12 or even more in terms of precipitation, but large areas that were drying out at that time and then again intensifying recently. And we'll kind of pull some of that together. Those last three maps were showing observed precipitation totals and radar estimated. This is looking at 30, 60, and 90-day precipitation as a percent of normal. And the upper left is the 30-day map. And again, that's the story to tell here, because you're looking at deep shades of red, which indicate that pretty much all of the state, probably over 90%, I would say, less than 10% of normal precipitation over the last 30 days. And at best, a few areas that got hit by some heavy downpours out of some isolated thunderstorms, up around 25 to 50% of normal. So incredibly dry over a very, very large area encompassing the entire state and beyond. And then on the right, again, you see that 60-day percent of normal, with the reds again in the range of 10 to 25%, and the oranges 50 to 75%, 75 to 90. So that just shows how quickly things have turned and dried out. So when you're looking over a more extended period there, then having 50% of precipitation over 60 days, or as shown in the bottom, over 90 days, that suggests that you've got some sustained dryness, and that's where we really start to see some concerns. So again, you can see the same kind of patterns there with the 90-day areas that are below 50% normal precipitation. But again, we go back far enough and we catch the tail end of that wetter start to the year. So basically, again, I'll just finish this with emphasizing how what we're seeing is unprecedented in terms of looking at our records that go back to the late 1800s. And I'll come back and hit on that again here. Temperature-wise, and this is also a big part of the story, and it's no surprise to anyone, on the left side there we see a map showing the departure from the average for maximum temperature over that period, September 2nd to October 1st, so a 30-day period. And parts of Kentucky, a good chunk of the central part of the state, 9 to even 10 degrees or more above normal on average for the entire 30-day period. So that truly is remarkable. And you can see on the scaling that we're clear over on the right end of the scale there. When we look at average minimum temperatures, again, we're still running above normal, but not quite as much. So again, very intense daytime heating, above normal temperatures at night, but not quite as much. And that reflects the drier air, a little bit lower dew points, perhaps, and just the magnitude of daily heating once that incoming solar radiation and clear skies starts to heat up a dry land surface. Okay. Talking about dry land surfaces, so on the left we have the National Weather Service Climate Prediction Center's calculated soil moisture ranking percentiles for Kentucky. And again, it's been a while since we have seen the shades of yellow, brown, red there showing up in our area. And we see that here over that last 30-day period. Again, possibly a little surprising that it's not even a bit lower, but again, we started the year on track for potentially record precipitation across the state. And then on the right-hand side, we're again looking at, these are remote sensed or calculated values. They are not based on observations, direct observations. We're looking at groundwater drought indicator. So trying to kind of penetrate a little bit more below the upper levels of the soil. And based on this product from NASA, suggests that we're only starting to see a hint of dryness once we get farther down. And that's really not surprising given how quickly the dry conditions have set in. So groundwater should be in a little bit better shape than soil moisture at this point. The evaporative demand drought index, again, this is an indicator of how thirsty the atmosphere is, how much water it wants to take up based on temperature, solar radiation, wind speed, based on humidity and such. And so a dry atmosphere, a hot, dry atmosphere is very thirsty and wants to take up as much water as it can get. And that's irrespective of what might be available for it to take through evapotranspiration. So again, on the left-hand side, you see a 1 month calculation for the period ending September 27th. And then on the right, you see the 2 month period ending on September 27th. And again, you see that the conditions in Kentucky and the Southeast have, over the last 30 days, been experiencing a very, very thirsty atmosphere. Now we'll take a look at some actual observations, and these are from some of our Kentucky Mesonet soil moisture monitoring sites. Again, we've got soil moisture at over half of our stations and continue to invest in probes around the state. Fulton County, I highlighted the axis there on the left-hand side because it's scaled differently than the others. It's bottoms out at 30% soil moisture by water fraction by volume. And so those soils over there are still quite a bit wetter. And again, Fulton County we've been highlighting for a while because it was one of the areas that really was inundated with precipitation the first half of the year. But you can see over the last couple months, and we're looking at a 6 month window here. In the past, we've been looking at 3 months. That last couple months there, we've really started to see things drop off, and even a little bit of decline in the deep soil moisture down at 40 inches, but 20 inches and shallower, very, very clearly seeing that water being depleted from the soil. Other than that, when you look at the others, we've got Breckinridge County, which was one of those areas that started to dry out way back in July and early August, and then Breathitt County over in eastern Kentucky, again, one of the areas that had been hit hard. That station in Breathitt County is right down near quicksand, near the stream there. So in theory, those soils should be a little wetter than if they were on a ridgetop over in eastern Kentucky. And then the lower right is Boyle County. So again, just the things to point out there, you can see for each of the levels, we're seeing a rapid decline in soil moisture. And you can look at those percentages there. We're getting certainly down in the 10% range for some of those near surface levels. But critical thing here, I think, is while we don't have a climatology, we haven't had these out long enough to know really what's normal. You can see, you know, when you look at Breathitt County, Boyle County, that those areas just until the last 30, 45 days or so, their deep soil moisture was pretty steady, but it's really started to drop off now. So that suggests that conditions are really deteriorating quite rapidly in terms of soil moisture across the state. Moving to stream flows, the 7-day average stream flows, we're starting to see some colors on there that we don't like. We've got some oranges and reds showing up. Kentucky River Basin and locations over in eastern Kentucky, and then the Green River Basin here in the western half of the state. And again, we were not seeing this kind of pattern or level of stream flows until this month. Again, this is the past 7-day average. Next slide will show the 28-day average, but I think you'll see that it's pretty similar in terms of the story that it's telling. And when we look at these maps, we basically you know, recognize that the drought, which has come on again extremely quickly, and hit agriculture quickly and hard, is now starting to extend into concerns about hydrologic drought and conditions, water supply issues that may become more of a concern going forward. Now moving specifically on to drought, here is the current release of the U.S. Drought Monitor that came out earlier this morning. And you can see for the first time since I believe probably 2016, the fall of 2016, we have some extreme drought conditions in eastern Kentucky and severe drought over a large portion of the state. And the entire state is at least abnormally dry. Beyond that, as you focus out on the southeast, you can see that drought conditions have now been raised, are now a concern pretty much throughout the South, except the southern half of Florida and a little bit of the coastal areas there that had gotten hit by a hurricane earlier this fall or late summer, I guess that was. And you see the dryness extending up into Ohio and Indiana and such. So this pattern, just a few months ago, we had hardly any drought anywhere in the country. And now we're starting to see a large portion of the eastern U.S. Being at least abnormally dry. So a very fundamental shift in terms of the pattern in the eastern part of the U.S. This map is looking at the change in drought status over the last month. And the colors are different, but the pattern is very similar to the previous one, which essentially is saying that the map that we just looked at is essentially all developed over the last month. So we see in Kentucky a 3-class degradation of drought conditions in that period. And again, these are very remarkable things. They simply do not happen very often. You can see down in northern Georgia, actually a 4-class degradation within a period of 1 month. But in general, we're starting to see across the country and down in Texas and out in the Four Corners area in the Southwest, we're starting to see more dryness develop and maybe a hint that this long period of wet conditions across the country is starting to be replaced by another circulation pattern. Again, time will tell how that continues to play out. And this is again a close-up looking at Kentucky in particular, and you can see the extreme drought conditions kind of centered there on Breathitt County, Perry County, and that part of eastern Kentucky. And then again, the severe drought stretching from the eastern margin of the state over pretty far in the western part, Union County and such. So nobody's really out of the woods on this, and these conditions have been changing rapidly. Got a couple slides here that try to put a little perspective on conditions. As a climatologist, can't resist looking at a lot of numbers and a lot of historical data. So bear with me while I try to explain a little bit of what we're looking at here. So the graphs are on the left. On the left side, it's a graph for the 2-month period of August and September. On the right hand, it's the same graph, but it's only for the month of September. So let's start on the left side. And on the horizontal axis, you see average temperature for that 2-month period. On the vertical axis, you see cumulative precipitation for that 2-month period. And then each point is plotted, represents a year in the climate record that goes back to 1895. So the points are actually represented with the year stamp. And if you look at the crosshairs, the blue crosshairs there, the vertical blue line, which is just a little bit above 71 degrees, is the median temperature temperature for that 2-month period going back to 1895. while the horizontal blue line is the median precipitation for that 2-month period, which is just under 7 inches. So again, the median means that half of the years were above and half of them were below. It's basically a coin flip as to whether you're above or below or on the left or right-hand side of that blue line. The dotted or dashed red lines are simply highlighting, kind of focused in on 2019. And again, note that these data for 2019 are estimates. They are not the data that will be released from NOAA here in a few days after they process all of their data sets. The 2019 data are based on the Mesonet, which should be very close to what NOAA puts out, but it's not going to be exactly the same thing. So you can see that we're in the lower right portion of that graph, again, indicating that we are hotter for that 2-month period than most years, with the exception of 1936, 1900, 1925, and 2007, which was again a recent drought year that many of you may remember. And we were also drier than most of those years for that 2-month period, including 1999 when we were leading into a drought, 1897. We've got a couple that are kind of laid over top of one another, but one of those numbers is 1983, which was another drought year, 1953. So that gives you an idea that that 2-month period was, while it wasn't the most extreme, it was certainly warmer and drier than what we would expect. But when you go to the right and look at September only, you can see again, the medians there for September, median precipitation just a little over 3 inches. And median temperature just a little bit under 69 degrees. Well, according to the Mesonet, we averaged over 74.5 degrees and had an average of 0.24 of an inch of precipitation statewide. To the extent that those numbers are accurate estimates, we would break the all-time record for the driest September, which was 0.3 inches in 1897, and come in as the second warmest September compared to 1925. So when you put that together, how dry it was and how hot it was, again, as the graph suggests, very simply unprecedented. So we see what's happened up to this point over the last 2-month period and the last 1-month period in historical context. But now let's kind of look ahead a little bit. I took those same graphs, but instead of plotting all those points, well, actually, let me back up. It's not the same graph. It's the same layout. Let me tell you what we're looking at here. On the left-hand side, we're looking at precipitation. On the right-hand side, temperature. On the horizontal axis, we're looking at, on the left, September precipitation, historical data. And then on the vertical axis, we're looking at October precipitation. So it's a before and after situation. And then on the right-hand graph, we're doing the same thing, but we're looking at temperature. So on the left, again, the dashed red line plots the 0.24 inches of precipitation estimated based on the Mesonet, which would be record setting. And then I just plotted only the points that were years in which we had less than 1.5 inches of rain in September. So other years that were extremely dry, although not near as dry as this year. And then I looked at, well, what happened the following month? What happened in September? Or excuse me, in October? And when you do that, you notice that you can count those up and find out that 9 out of 15 Octobers that followed very dry Septembers ended up with a below median precipitation. So again, this is a coin flipping exercise in essence. So you could ask the question, if you flip a coin 15 times, what's the probability of getting 9 or more years below the median? And if you do those calculations with a binomial probability distribution, it comes out to be about a 30% chance of that happening just at random. So 9 out of 15 is something to pay attention to in terms of a pattern. And on the right-hand side, again, I plotted hot Septembers, and I chose Septembers that were at least 72.5 degrees, more than 3 degrees above normal, and that produced 11 such years. And of those 11 hot Septembers, eight out of those 11 years, October was above the median in temperature. And the odds of having at least 8 out of 11 above the line is only about 11% by chance alone. So both of these graphs, while they do not look at all at what the current atmospheric circulation is or the teleconnections, they simply say that if you look historically, there's some predictability that suggests that if it's hot and dry in September, odds are favoring that it's going to be hotter than average and drier than average in October. But again, that's just from historical climatology. All right, Megan, I'm going to start real quickly on impacts and then shift it back to you and Matt. But there's not a whole lot humorous about the current situation, but I did get a chuckle out of this map. We've been showing the monthly storm reports, and it's typical to have a map filled with symbols, and we had one for the last 30-day period, and that was not even an observed. It was a radar-indicated report of penny-sized hail in Lewis County. So with that, Megan, I'll send it back to you.
All right, so now that we've talked about the recent conditions, now we're going to move toward the agricultural impacts, and we're going to have Matt Dixon from the Ag Weather Center talk for a minute.
So thanks, Stu and Megan. First off, I mean, just as Stu was saying, this is unprecedented what we're seeing now. First off, I want to send a thank you out to all the county agents, farmers, producers. I've been talking with them over the last couple of weeks, and I notice many are on the call right now. I'll tell you what, your reports are much appreciated. I can't stress that enough, and it helps out tremendously. It's definitely good to have eyes across the state. So starting off, obviously it's been very dry on the ag side over the past couple months. We mentioned earlier this will probably be the driest September ever, and top 3 or top 2, as Stu said, warmest on record. I did a bit of digging this past week and how often this actually happens in Kentucky. Simply stated, it hardly ever happens. You can probably see that from the data Stu was showing. What we're seeing now is unprecedented. Of course, September and October, they're normally our driest times of the year, but even in a dry year, we see rain every once in a while. For many, the last significant rain came on the 26th and 27th of last month, so it's been quite some time. That since has been followed by 4 straight weeks of much below, if any, rainfall. I know Lexington hasn't seen rain for quite some time, 30-some-odd days now. So looking back to 1895, looking at the data, it has only happened 3 other times when a month ended and placed in both the top 5 driest months of all time and top 5 warmest months of all time. Those months include July of 1901, July of 1930, and most recently, August of 2007. So I'm sure many on this call remember the drought back in 07. Bottom line, this is the kind of combination that rarely happens, and especially this late in the year. Looking at the slide, starting out, I just want to point out some stats from the latest Kentucky crop report below. Soil moisture has diminished tremendously. It's taken a complete 180-degree turn from last year. In 2018, you see most of the bar graph is green and blue. There, the third row over, symbolizing mostly adequate surplus moisture. That's just simply not the case now. Right now, 87% of topsoil is rated short to very short. 80% of subsoil is rated the same. So those are big numbers, and big numbers on the wrong side of the spectrum we want to be on. Both are much worse than that 5-year average you see over on the right-hand side that we typically see at this time of year. So bottom line, it's dry, and that's probably an understatement right now. Looking at the crop progress table, the dry conditions have pushed tremendous dry down, and also harvest is progressing rapidly. 58% of corn is now harvested, and beans are 19%, both ahead of that 5-year average. In one particular situation, the A&R agent in Todd County told me that was the first time he can remember when they started harvesting corn in late August and literally never stopped. So didn't have any breaks in that rain. Over to the right, this is right behind my house in Scott County. It's been a dusty ride for many of these farmers out there. You didn't want to be in my backyard at this time, but he's cutting beans in that picture, but quite a bit of dust. The rapid dry down has led to some moisture level problems. Looking at the graph in the top right, this is from Dr. Sam McNeil in the Department of Biosystems and Ag Engineering at UK. You really want beans going to the elevator at 13% moisture content and corn at about 15%. This year, I've been getting many reports across the state of 7, 8, 9% on beans, well below that 13% number, and 11, 12% on corn, so well below 15%. Farmers they're simply losing money from the rapid dry down. Just as an example, the x-axis there shows moisture levels as a percentage. The vertical axis is the cents that would be lost per bushel. If I trace up a line from 10% on beans, so we're looking at that red line through there, it is about a 30% loss per bushel on $9 beans, and that is about what beans are selling at right now, perhaps a little lower in the $8 so on range. But so in the end, the lower you get under 13, the more you lose, and that adds up quickly when you have hundreds upon thousands of acres in some cases. So next, the dry conditions also hit at a terrible time for late planted crops, especially beans. Yields were hit tremendously and crops were damaged in cases. Some beans may not have anything in the pods. It was mentioned in an article previously by Ray Smith, he's an extension forage specialist at UK, that with the hay yields down greatly this year, it may be possible to use some of those damaged soybeans for hay or baleage. Saying that, he did say to make sure to check with your crop adjuster before cutting any drought-damaged soybeans. And saying all that, if anyone is interested, feel free to send me an email after the webinar. It's matt.dixon@uky.edu, and I can send that article if you're interested. Lastly, I'm hearing more about fire issues as we move forward. One combine fire was reported from Curtis Dame in Hopkins County. He mentioned to me on the phone that moving forward, you have to be careful where you park these things, especially in the case of Hopkins if there's fuel tanks nearby. So definitely want to be careful. Sometimes it can happen long after you finish. So Clint Hardy up in Davies County mentioned some were hauling water tankers to the fields to help if there were any fire concerns. So taking those precautionary steps is huge right now. It doesn't take much to spark a fire with how dry it is. Looking ahead as it concerns the row crops, harvest will continue in full force over the next month. Depending on moisture, winter wheat will be planted through the end of October and into the start of November. Otherwise, it's hard to believe, but we are actually approaching our average first frost and freeze dates, after coming off middle 90s this past week. The growing season is winding down. With that, let's move on to the next slide. So pastures and hay. Over the past month, pastures and forages have probably taken one of the biggest hits from the extended dry weather. Fall grazing is basically nil now for much of the state. Grass is becoming increasingly dormant. You can see the brown pasture there by Brandon Sears in Madison County. The other is from Morgan Hayes down in Boyle County, central portions of the state. But The bottom picture from Morgan really reminded me more of something you would see in the desert Southwest. So definitely no green in those pictures. I've heard some producers say cattle are still picking. Put picking in quotations on the rotational graze pastures, but that will likely only last for a couple more weeks in most cases. Most have started feeding winter hay at this point, which is well ahead of normal, 1 to 2 months in some cases. Some even as far west as west central Kentucky, Muhlenberg area, have been feeding for 3 weeks now. Fall grazing is bottom line very limited right now, and with the frost-free season right around the corner, growth will be limited moving forward. So looking ahead, the latest crop report shows hay supplies. We look at that table right there. Hay supplies report at 10% very short, 28% short, 60% adequate, and 2% surplus. Asking county agents across the state, I've heard numerous reports that the latest cuts of hay were about 50% normal. One producer in Mercer County reported that he normally gets 100 large round bales in the spring. That number goes to about 60 in the fall. It was cut in half to 30 this fall, and that was with doing some additional acreage than usual. So yields way down. In some instances, it's not worth the cut because there's more costs in harvesting. So stockpiling forages hasn't happened this year because of that. So this will likely put forages in short supply this winter. UK forage specialists are mentioning to check hay inventories. If you need and have the opportunity to get hay, do it now. Lastly, if you had some pasture renovations done early on and hit the August rainfall, it may have been enough to germinate the seed, but with the dry September, it's hard to get established. Pastures will be renovated for a number of reasons, from replacing old stands to introducing a new species. The table below gives an idea of the primary and secondary seeding dates for different forage species here in Kentucky. Many producers have held off for fear of failure on pasture renovations this fall. Simply no moisture in the ground. If the seed germinates and is exposed to a dry period like we've been seeing, it will likely fail. So the prime time for pasture renovation is August 15th to September 15th, talking with the forage specialist. Many will go to October 1st, and I just talked to one producer that may consider some species to October 15th, but overall the window is passing. Saying that, there's still plenty of time for wheat and some select species. But overall, one thing I want to mention is that I've heard from multiple producers that sorghum Sudan grass, you see it on that graph below, it has done extremely well this year with the dry conditions and heat. So that's one of the few species that has thrived a bit with less moisture in place. So looking ahead, if producers do see some rain in the forecast, they might seed some pastures. So otherwise it's too dry. So let's move on to the next slide now. So water supplies. While the first half of the year was extremely wet, we haven't been seeing it, or there's not much in the way of long-term impacts, or being seen in the way of long-term impacts, but they are starting to show. Looking at ag, ponds and streams are becoming questionable recently as a source of water. Levels vary across the state, but some of the most dramatic losses have been across southeastern Kentucky, central Kentucky, and the southern bluegrass. As you can see in the pictures provided, I've got photos from Courtney Jenkins in McGiffin County, Morgan Hayes in Boyle County, Matt Adams in Hardin, and Daryl Simpson in Muhlenberg. So across the state, Courtney pointed out there in the stream, the picture of the stream, there's usually at least a foot of water pooling at the end of that tile, but it just hasn't happened this year. Not even a drop in there now. Pond and stream levels are down across the board. Most significant I've seen is in Boyle County. You see that picture from Morgan, and she did mention to me that cattle do use this pond, but I did not include this in this webinar, but she sent me another picture of a pond, and cattle do not use that one, and it was down tremendously also. So no matter if cattle use it or not, they're getting lower. So this was a case there in boil, but some farmers are now looking for other sources of water. Reports of hauling water is becoming more prevalent, especially throughout the severe and extreme drought areas of Kentucky. Some are even moving cattle closer to the barn for access to city water. So that, and with how dry these ponds are getting, some producers are cleaning out the ponds to add more volume in the future. So quite a bit going on in farm ponds and streams right now also. So, and let's go to the last slide, look at horticulture and forestry. They've both been hit hard by the dry weather also. Look at the slide. I included a couple pictures from Ellen Crocker, who is an assistant professor in forest health extension at UK. Just like row crops and pastures, trees are also becoming very water stressed. Leaves are dropping, not just because of the fall season. She mentioned also seeing a lot of brown leaves still on trees and cracks in the soil, which can hurt tree roots. Surface moisture is being exhausted, and talking to John Strang, a hort specialist with UK, deeper moisture is also becoming a concern. Trees depend on that deep moisture as their emergency reserves, and he mentioned that fruit trees will need water to develop sufficient cold weather hardiness as we move forward. He said farmers may even need to water a bit going forward if it doesn't rain. Interesting to say, extreme heat has also played a part in tree fruits having trouble developing proper sugar content. It simply doesn't taste that great. And high respiration rates has also caused fruit to show little color. Now, with the cooler, much welcome cooler temperatures coming tomorrow, that color should pick up with the cooler weather ahead. So, and then as a side note, I want to add, he said strawberries will also need water soon to initiate flowers for next spring. So, all in all, that's what I got. A lot of impacts on the agricultural side. It's definitely taking a big hit right now. So I'll pass this back to Megan.
Thank you, Matt. And I am going to go ahead and bring on Bill Caldwell and Chip Zimmer from the Kentucky Division of Water.
I need a slide. Oh, that's you, Chip.
All right, I'm going to start off. First, before I talk about this, I just wanted to talk about what Matt was just talking about with the combine fires. Apparently, I just saw there's one in Mercer County that's so large that you can see the smoke in Lexington. So just something to pass along. But I'm going to talk really quickly about water supply impacts. We really do not have too much to talk about right now. There's a few things I have on here. Georgetown has an advisory out just asking people to conserve water, and that's because Royal Spring is running low, but they can pull 100% of their water from Frankfort, so they're not going to be running out of water anytime soon. Bullock Pen and Olive Hill both have their ponds or their supply lakes are getting a little low, and they're going to need to be watching. And the city of Benham, which pulls from a mine shaft, they're getting low, and they're going to have to be pulling from a stream there. So they have an alternative source that they're going to have to start using. I also highlight the Kentucky River. It is low, and Bill will get a little more on that, but the real issue is just been a taste and odor issue. Frankfort, Georgetown, Lexington have all been reporting some kind of earthy tasting. Yeah, I live in Georgetown, so I've been drinking it. It's not the greatest tasting thing, but there's no real supply issues. It's not going to be running out of water anytime soon, but just a kind of a taste issue. And Bill will go into some more about this. So next slide, and I'll turn it over to Bill.
Thanks, Chip. What I've got here really is something a little bit different than the normal direct impacts of drought. I'm calling it drought impact multipliers. And by that, I mean during droughts, strange things happen. And so I'm going to go over a couple of these things that kind of happen during droughts that you don't get to see. In this particular case, the one I'm going to tell you first, we haven't seen for about 12 years, since 2007. Now, what I've got here is a map of the Kentucky River Basin, and I've basically divided it into upper, middle, and lower. In the upper basin, you've got the forks, the north, middle, and south fork. You've got 2 Corps of Engineer lakes, and about 60% of the flow in the Kentucky River Basin during droughts is going to come from just that upper part. Now, in the middle part, and you're going to see up in there, you'll see Lexington is in the middle part. That's our primary big demand portion of the pool with Kentucky American and Richmond and Winchester and Nicholasville. And then in the lower portion of the pool, that's where we have all of the upstream dynamics contribute to whatever the flow ends up being at Frankfort. And that includes drainage area and climate. The climate side is kind of hard to predict. The core lakes and their releases are pretty predictable. Withdrawals from all of the pools are very predictable. But then we have Herrington Lake, you'll see there in the middle part of the basin, releases water, and that's not too predictable. And also, there's a hydro plant there at Lock 7, Pool 7 there by Harrodsburg. And that's kind of what the focus of these next few slides is going to be on. Next slide, please. Okay, now we've zoomed in on the middle part of the Kentucky River Basin. There on the left, you'll see a red circle. Now, that red circle is really showing you where Lock and Dam 7 is. And within that Lock and Dam 7, we have water coming out of Herrington Lake into Pool 7. We have outflow going in, through, and around the hydro plant and the dam at Pool 7. And then we have Harrodsburg pulling water out of Pool 7. So there's a lot going on in Pool 7. And on the right, I've just kind of blown out and shown you an expanded look of the pools, going from Pool 9 in the southeast down to Pool 4 in Frankfort. That's where this impact multiplier is going to show up. Next, please. Now, we've zoomed in even further on the hydro dam and the lock at 7. Now, the left picture is one of, this is from Google Earth from April 11th of 2017. And that's kind of how it looks most of the time. It's a little high, but that's about 6,000 CFS. That's a good spring flow. And over on the left, you can see the hydro plant. You can see all that water that's going around it and through it. You can also see a lot of water going over the dam. Now look at the right picture. That's from September 12th of 2010. Pretty dry month, and on this day, flow at this lock and dam was about 300 CFS. And you can see that most of the obvious turbulent flow is going through the hydro plant there. You can see just a small sheet of water going over the dam itself. So pretty big contrast between those two. Now, this next slide on the left is on September 12th of this year. That is Lock and Dam 7. And I think what you'll notice is that there's no flow going over the dam. The flow direction is going from your left to your right. And you can see in the background the hydro dam. And again, look below that hydro dam back there, and you can see the water coming out and through. What this says is that the water coming into Pool 7 from upstream is now less than what's flowing out in and around that dam and the hydro plant. On the right, I have a stage graph of Pool 7 right there. And this is a time series basically from September 1st through the end of September. And you can see that the red line across near the top of the stage graph on the left is gauge height. So when you go below that red line, the water level in Pool 7 has dropped below the dam crest. That's what you're seeing. And so on or around the 5th, it dropped to crest, then it slightly recovered when the turbines were shut down, and then it started to just go down below crest and didn't look back. On the 14th, if you can see that, September 14th, about a third of the way through the graph on the x-axis, a little flat spot. That was where they slowed down one of the turbines, but the pool continued to drop until about September 16th or 17th when they put in a large cutoff wall and controlled a lot of the flow going through one of the turbines, and at that point, the pool level started to come back up. Currently, it's at about 8.5 feet, which is about 0.7 of a foot below normal pool. Next slide. Okay, what's the impact multiplier? Well, if you look back at the Kentucky River Basin and you look at those 3 graphs I have on the left, the one on the bottom is the one you just saw. That's the gauge height at 7. The next one, the one in the middle, is the dam and lock at pool 6. That's the gauge there. And then the last graph on top is the dam and lock at lock 4, where Frankfurt is. So if you just line up, on the left shows you what the flow is, and as you go across the x-axis, you're getting the entire month of September. You can see when we drop below crest on about September 9th or 10th, you can see that both the flow at 6 and at 4 leveled off, which indicates there was about 300 CFS moving in and around the dam. Now, as the flow continued to drop, at some point on the 16th and the 17th, they were able to cut off flow through about half of that, the turbines, and you see pool 7 begin to recover. At that point, we've leveled off again, so what we see in the river below pool 7 is what's coming through 7, through the dam, through the turbines, and around the hydro plant. The good news is it's going to stay that way because it's nothing but leakage. There's nothing going over that dam. Okay, next. Now I'd like to show you another one here, another impact multiplier, because the previous one, really the biggest drought impact was in the upper basin in pool 9. But what's going on down in 7 multiplied that drought impact such that it's almost like the river has been turned upside down. It's lower down at Frankfurt than it is up at pool 9, which really doesn't happen very often. And you only see it during these kinds of droughts. Okay, this last slide here is another multiplier. And this one is interesting because what it shows is that the drought is impacting the tool that you're using to monitor it. And that makes it extremely difficult sometimes to interpret what you're seeing. If we go clockwise from left, the top one is Kentucky River at Whitesburg. The next one to the right is the Cumberland River near Harlan. Then the lower right is Beach Fork at Bardstown, and the lower left is Dix River near Danville. Now I've got red circles circling where the pool stage or the discharge is just suddenly flattened off, and then after that point continued to rise. And so you'd ask yourself, during the month of September, we've had no rain, how can these things be rising? Well, what happens is when gauges get really low, sometimes leaf litter and other debris can form a new little dam on whatever the control point is for that gauge. And what will happen is the pool that gauge is measuring will slowly start to come back up and then reach a new level. When this happens, if you look at the Whitesburg one at the upper left, at some point, if that obstruction is removed, look what happened at Whitesburg, the upper left graph, all of a sudden the flow went from about 20, currently down to about 6. So, for the last 3 weeks, maybe we've been looking at Whitesburg saying, man, they're doing well up there. We got no problems in Whitesburg. But the fact is that this multiplier of this drought impact was giving us some erroneous readings, and the true values were much, much lower. And when we saw this start to happen just not too long ago, I had been kind of feeling smug and good about the whole situation for the hydrologic drought this year. I looked at Chip and said, man, that's a game changer. So these impact multipliers are kind of secondary impacts from droughts that we really need to kind of know exist. They're not a huge problem if you know they exist. So that's what I've got.
Thank you, Chip and Bill. We are going to go ahead and move on to the forecasted conditions, and I'm going to bring Stuart Foster back on.
Yes, thank you, Megan, and thanks to Matt, Chip, and Bill. I'm looking ahead now. Tired of looking back. So the next 7 days, quantitative precipitation forecast actually has a little bit of hope in there. You can see a forecast of 7-day precipitation totals for Kentucky, part of the state, in the range of up to about 2 inches of rain, and a good inch over much of the state beyond that. Again, it's a forecast and would represent a change from what we've seen. Now, one bit of caution in looking at that, though, is forecasts are going to get adjusted on a daily basis or so, but that band basically has us in a bullseye. But if it shifts a little bit as the forecast evolves, if you look to the north and west at parts of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, you see that they're projecting to have a quarter of an inch or less, and likewise to the southeast. So we're hoping in this case to be under the bullseye and to stay there would provide some much needed precipitation for us. Beyond that, 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlooks, nothing too encouraging there. In both cases, we're in shades of brown, indicating that we have a slightly enhanced probability of being below normal precipitation wise. So you can see that 40% line cutting across the state. So again, that would indicate about a 40% chance of below normal precip, about a 33% chance of near normal, and then about a 27% chance of above normal precipitation. So the odds are stacked toward below normal for that 6 to 10, 8 to 14 day outlook. And again, keep in mind at this point that we're in a dry month, so being above normal doesn't necessarily mean that's a lot of rain even then. If we look at the monthly outlook, temperature-wise on the left, a very high degree of confidence that the southeastern United States is going to remain in a hot pattern with above normal temperatures. So virtually no chance, very less than 10%, that we would be below normal temperature-wise. So we can plan on being warmer than normal for the month of October, and if it turns out to be wrong, then that would be great. And then on the right side, that precipitation outlook, and note that both of these products from the Climate Prediction Center that come out in the middle of September on the 16th were updated on the 30th to reflect changes that had occurred. And this map really adds that focus on dry conditions in the southeast. So you can see basically a continuing impact of that ridge and a divide there with above normal precipitation in the upper Midwest. So we've seen in the news about the heavy snow out in the west and the dominance of the high pressure in the east. So it's a similar kind of pattern where there could be some blocking with the high pressure and forcing precipitation up around to our northwest. We'll see how that plays out, but again, not particularly encouraging for us. And the seasonal outlook, October, November, December, no indication on the right side precipitation-wise, equal chances of above, near, or below normal. If you wanted to read into that, you could say, well, it's a positive thing that on both sides to the east and west, there are areas with slightly enhanced probability of above normal precipitation. So if we're looking for a positive, maybe that's a little bit of one there. And then on the left side, again, likely to be above normal temperature-wise. And the above normal temperature forecasts reflect not only the current circulation, modes of circulation, teleconnections and such, but also just the trend of warmer temperatures through time over the last few decades. So that's a seasonal perspective. Again, temperature and precipitation. We'll move on and take a look at the wildland fire potential. And I put on the left side the map for September. So that was the map that we had last month. And you can see that Kentucky was kind of singled out for having below normal wildland fire potential for that product, which was issued on the 1st of September. And again, it had been wet through the summer. As Matt had mentioned, A lot of places had a significant rainfall late in August, around the 26th or so. So even after some dry conditions, had been wet, been recent rains, but flip that 1 month and we've got a lot of bright red throughout the southeastern part of the country, indicating what we've already become aware of from the news here in Kentucky, that we're in the above normal category of risk for fire potential. So we just have to think back 3 years to 2016, which was a difficult year fire-wise here in the state, and it could be a similar kind of situation playing out this fall. We'll hope that changes, but the above normal outlook at this point. And next slide, which I think is our last outlook slide, mean stream flow outlook. We've got a lot of orange, which we had not been seeing there throughout Kentucky, indicating that from the Ohio River Forecast Center perspective, they're anticipating an enhanced likelihood of below normal stream flows during a time of year when stream flows are normally low to start with. So very much reflecting the conditions over the last month. And you can see from that how different things are to our north, per se. Otherwise, I took out the slides on flood potential. I decided we probably just didn't need to talk about that this month. So Megan, we'll go on to the last slide, I believe, and just try to summarize some of this. Again, September unprecedented for its combination of extreme heat and dryness. Ag sector, particularly livestock, but as Matt mentioned, really extending across agriculture, all aspects of agriculture, experiencing adverse impacts that are likely to persist over the near term and certainly could intensify if this current pattern does not change. Concerns about water supplies, heard from our friends at Division of Water, starting to have some concerns. They simply weren't out there before. But starting to pay attention to a few things, and we would typically think that the water utilities that draw out of smaller watersheds or in the headwater regions of a basin would be the ones that would need to keep an eye on a little bit more than others. But again, the positive thing is that we're going into the cooler season of the year, so demand for water is going to be dropping here before long. Next one there, based on combination of climatology outlooks and persistence, the persistence of weather, there's an elevated risk that drought conditions could intensify and do so at a rapid rate through October, certainly if it's a near repeat of September. If drought does persist and intensify, then we certainly expect that the impacts are likely to intensify and start to spread increasingly beyond agriculture. But again, that's looking ahead. We'll see how that plays out. That's I won't say in a nutshell because we had a lot there today and a lot of contributors, which we really appreciate, but I'll pass it back to you, Megan, and then I guess we have some time to take some questions and such.
All right, sorry about that. Thank you, Stu, and thank you again, Chip and Bill and Matt, for your contribution. So now we'll move to questions and discussion. If any of you that are listening in have any questions that you'd like to ask, somebody would be more than happy to answer. So if you have a question, go ahead and unmute your microphone and go ahead and ask.
Megan?
Yes, Stu?
I saw in the chat there's a question, it got hidden there, so I don't see it now, but about when we would have another update. And
yeah, I see that now. That was from Daniel Carpenter. He says, when will drought status be updated again?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question, and one that's on people's minds. So of course, the U.S. Drought Monitor update will come out weekly on Thursday, every Thursday morning, and these webinars, we've been scheduled for a once a month event, but I think we have the flexibility that if conditions continue to deteriorate and warrant, we could certainly look at having another event in a couple weeks, but probably wait to make a call on that to see how things play out. And again, really what the demand is for them. So it would, I think if people are telling us they want some more current information here in a couple weeks, then we need to respond to that.
All right, if there are no other questions, our next scheduled webinar is November 7th, and this is again after the time changes happen, so it's 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. And as Stu just mentioned, if you have any feedback or if you're interested in having more frequent meetings like this, then please contact us either by email or phone, and we would be happy to take that into consideration. So with that, thank you everybody for attending, and thank you to our presenters, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.